I think that a convincing argument can be made that the witch trials of the early modern period are the first truly European event. Not since the days of the Roman Empire had there been such clear cultural, religious, and juridical unanimity. From the colonies of the New World, to the frozen north of Iceland, to the heartland of Central Europe, to the gates of Moscow. One common denominator shared by all of these regions was the systematic extermination of so-called witches. Europe was unable to form an identity around what it was, but it could singularly unite against the perceived threat of the witch. Despite this, it is only recently that systematic scholarly investigation into what has to be one of the most complicated phenomena in European history has taken place. Why? I think the answer here is perhaps shame or embarrassment, that a continent could collectively engage in mass murder based upon senseless metaphysical conjecture, quote-unquote spectral evidence, the illogic of conspiracy theory, and widespread cultural misogyny simply doesn't paint a very rosy picture about the past. It also isn't terribly encouraging about the future, unless of course one learns from the past. I mean, after the witch trials, Europeans would never engage in systematic violence and widespread mass murder, would they? Oh yeah. Oof. Well, maybe third time's a charm when it comes to that whole learning from history bit. The exact historical mechanisms that led to the so-called witch craze and the subsequent execution of tens of thousands of people, mostly women, is still a matter of scholarly debate. History is simply a messy thing, and simple answers are almost always wrong. That which leaves out the mess simply isn't history. In this episode of Esoterica, I want to present the provocative theory of Sylvia Federici, in which she argues that the witch trials were not only a peripheral European event, but a core aspect not only of the rise of capitalism, but of modernity itself. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion. The witch trials of early modern Europe were cultural-wide, beginning in the mid-15th century and lasting into the middle of the 18th century, with the most murderous period being between roughly 1550 and 1650. Exactly how many people were murdered remains a bit unclear, although current estimates range roughly between 40 and 60,000 people. The trials occurred in major cities, in rural villages, and in virtually every corner of Europe. They were perpetuated by highly trained ecclesiastical jurists, learned secular authorities, and near-illiterate mercenary witch hunters, among both Catholics and Protestants. The witch hunt spawned an entirely new demonological literature, including the infamous tome of witch hunting, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, in 1486. Shockingly, even someone like Thomas Hobbes, the materialist founder of modern political philosophy, encouraged the prosecution of witches despite the fact that he believed that they had no supernatural power. This, to me, reveals the true horror of the witch trials. Even in the forward thinking of someone like Thomas Hobbes, the witches had to be persecuted, even if they weren't real. This is why I reject the term witch craze. The term craze intimates that the perpetrators of this mass murder were somehow out of their mind, which seems only to act to lessen their culpability. To be sure, the trials were a systematic act of mass murder, using the entire apparatus of theological justification, juridical sanction, and state violence. And it is exactly the systematic, ubiquitous nature of the trials that calls out for profound and sustained analysis. That is to say, why did Europeans beginning in the mid-15th century decide to begin the systematic prosecution and execution of their wives, mothers, sisters, neighbors, and even their own co-religionists? Of course, the answer here is incredibly complicated and likely very historically overdetermined. The late medieval theological innovation which linked witchcraft and heresy in the form of diabolism, the social antagonism between town and country, widespread cultural misogyny, and heresy hunting in overdrive, heightened religious tensions with the rise of Protestantism, and the social stressors brought on by the Little Ice Age all share some part in the explosion of violence. Though, what I want to focus on in this episode is a theory brought forward by Sylvia Federici in her 2004 book, Caliban and the Witch. For Federici, the Middle Ages were not marked by their social stasis, but by widespread social instability. In many places, the social control mechanism of serfdom was beginning to break down. The rise of the medieval city meant massive population transfer, in a shift in production for subsistence to production for profit. We also encountered the rise of the money economy and the widespread peasant resistance to the enclosure of the commons. By the High Middle Ages, urban women were also enjoying a great deal of social autonomy, including upward social mobility and widespread guild representation. Millenarian and so-called heretical groups were actively challenging the hegemony of the Catholic Church. Urban workers, especially in the Northern European textile industry, were consistently challenging the monopoly and the hierarchy of the system of the guilds. Bawdy university students were turning to secular professions, rakish lifestyles, and even sorcery. The Europe of 1325 was anything other than stable. It was a social powder keg. What lit the match, according to Federici, was the Black Death. Italian trade brought ships, and on those ships was cargo, and in that cargo were rats, and on those rats were fleas, and in those fleas was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. The plague, or the Black Death, or the Great Mortality, as it was called at that time, swept through Europe, killing up to half of the population in certain areas from 1348 to 1351. The social effect was positively tectonic and tremendous. And crucial for Federici's theory is the labor shortage it created. With so many workers killed, those that remained could and did demand higher wages. One aristocratic lord commented on the situation thus: "The peasants are too rich, and they don't know what obedience means. They don't take any law into account, and they wish they were nobles, and they would like to decide what rent we should get for our lands." I have to admit here, I'm kind of feeling the peasants' logic. Overall wages and buying power would rise in the aftermath of the plague, before peaking between 1450 and 1500 to levels that they would not reach again for centuries. And it is into this situation, the rising tide of peasants and workers in the European heartland, the conquest of the New World beginning in the 16th century, and the rise of the slave trade, that Federici locates the horrifying logic of the witch trials. For her, the witch trials are part of a larger struggle to settle social antagonisms, in the interest of the landed gentry and the ascendant and urban mercantile class. The first wing of her argument is perhaps the most basic. High wages are simply anathema to the landed gentry, the mercantilists, and the owners of the primitive factories. Workers simply want to work as little as possible for as much as possible, and bosses want workers to work as much as possible for as little as possible. But given the labor shortage in the aftermath of the Black Death, this puts both sides of that equation at loggerheads, and indeed into open conflict in the streets if the situation in the Northern European textile industry is any indicator. There's really only one workaround from the point of view of the purchasers of labor power. Either pay workers less and wager upon incurring their wrath, or find some mechanism to increase overall labor power. That is to say, you have to find some way to either make production more efficient, or you have to find a way to make more workers. And this is where Federici understands the inner workings of the witch hunts to be less about finding and prosecuting so-called witches. In fact, the evidence seems to dismiss that any such witches, especially as some European-wide heresy in the mind of witch hunters, existed at all. But rather, for Federici, the inner logic of the witch hunts was not about seeking out heresy, but about targeting women's bodies and especially their knowledge around their own reproductive technologies. If the theological developments around diabolism and heresy could be linked to the specific control over women's fertility, then the wielders of such technology could be targeted for extermination. It is here that Federici notes the continual and conspicuous between women's bodies, their sexuality, and especially fertility and women's autonomous control over that technology in the mind and texts of the witch hunters. This is so much so that if one begins to read much of the demonological literature of this time, one begins to notice that the term maleficia, or witchcraft, simply becomes a byword for birth control, abortifacients, and the lingering and persistent myth of the witch as a killer of infants. Of course, this doesn't require that every witch hunter had these ideas in mind when they went about their grim task. Most of us don't think of ourselves as carrying out widespread social agendas when we go about our daily lives and work, but of course we are. But for Federici, this was the overall effect of the logic of the witch hunts. Further, the labor of women, especially in the urban environment, came under attack. As I mentioned earlier, in the time period before the Black Death, women had established themselves as urban workers with a significant degree of social autonomy. Their representation in the guilds, as you can see on the screen, is positively shocking to modern ears when we consider the stereotype of the medieval woman. It was in the urban environment that accusations of witchcraft were used to destroy this rising tide of women's autonomy in the cities. As such accusations and prosecutions against independent, literate, and autonomous women could and did mean property confiscation and transfer of that property to the church and other male-dominated guilds. Relying on age-old misogyny, the church and the mercantile class could levy working-class men against working-class women, increasingly creating a situation in which public waged labor was the domain of men, and private, unwaged, domestic labor became the domain of women. The stereotype of the medieval woman as pregnant, barefoot, and in the kitchen was the result of just this process, rather than an accurate representation of the role of urban medieval women prior to it. Finally, for Federici, all of these processes have to be put into their global context, which, of course, is the conquest of the New World and the rise of the slave trade. Federici sees the witch trials and the devaluation of women's labor in the European context as a kind of beta test for the logical conquest, colonial expropriation, and slavery. In her analysis, it's crucial to see the link between the early understanding and representation of the indigenous peoples of the Americas as cannibals, pagans, and devil worshippers, alongside the similar image of the European witch. If the so-called witch could be expropriated of her labor, her land, and her life for the secret crime of witchcraft, then so much more could an entire population of people who actively and publicly reject the Christian faith. The debates between De las Casas and Sepulveda about whether the indigenous people even have souls to save seems to hinge on the juridical reasoning developed under the witch trials and the Reconquista. And of course, this is to say nothing about the centuries of European Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. The witch trials seem to end just as capitalism and eventually liberalism had gained hegemony over Europe and the Americas, following the defeat of the peasant rebellions led by people like Thomas Müntzer, the suppression of women's bodies and their control over fertility technologies, and the domination of the early worker and the proto-factories. But for Federici, this isn't just historical correlation, there is in fact historical causation at work here. For her, the witch hunts are pivotal in this process. They were a key part of the so-called primitive accumulation of capital that underwrote the transition from feudalism to capitalism. In her analysis, both modernity and capitalism were built, in significant part by trials that left tens of thousands of women brutalized and murdered. The trials of these European women would become a grim harbinger of what would unfold in the Americas and Africa. If you're interested in the history of magic, mysticism, and the occult, make sure to subscribe. They're all core content here at Esoterica, and perhaps you'd consider supporting our work on Patreon or with a one-time donation. Needless to say, Federici's theory is compelling, provocative, and controversial. Rather than seeing the witch trials as a peripheral event in European history, she sees them as a core aspect of the transition to the modern capitalist world. Of course, to really evaluate her thesis, you need to read her fantastic book, Caliban and the Witch. Indeed, the endnotes alone are a wealth of information in themselves. My only real complaint about the book is that I wish there were several more volumes to really fully flesh out her argument. Sometimes the book reads a bit like a research agenda for filling several more books. It's also worth noting that in 2018, Federici published a kind of sequel to the text, entitled Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women, which is also well worth checking out. This text is great because it extends her arguments into the contemporary period, so well worth checking out. To be sure, Federici's thesis should be read against the standard histories of the witch trials, especially Levack's The Witch Hunt in Early Modern Europe. If you're interested in primary sources about the witch hunts, there are two really great volumes in English. The first is Witchcraft in Europe, 400 to 1700, A Documentary History. And of course the other is Levack's The Witchcraft Sourcebook. Both are mines of insight into the structure and development of the concept of the witch and the witch trials more generally. I'd also highly suggest the Oxford Handbook of Witchcraft in Early Modern Europe and Colonial America, especially for its region-by-region analysis of the witch trials. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.